I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the other two works you were assigned for today. Hagia Sophia rather uses up the available oxygen. I also don't plan to repeat the Khan Academy information, or at least not all of it, but let me make a few points. You need to know the term illuminated manuscript. Illuminated just means illustrated, but in this case, the work really was also luminous. Why? Well, the writing was in silver, so it would have gleamed. Heavy use of gold and precious metals is characteristic of Byzantine work, as you've just seen. You've encountered continuous narratives before. It's one of the ways artists solve the problem of choosing which part of a narrative to tell. They just don't choose. So, what are the more classical characteristics of this work? Yes, there are bodies under those clothes. We also see classical architecture in that rather intriguing twisted bridge. Finally, the frieze structure itself suggests classical narrative. Think of Trajan's column. This also makes continuous narrative clear. I've circled all the figures in green. Those are Jacob. Oops. I think the comparison makes the contrast between classical and Byzantine style clearer. So in the portrait of Justinian and his attendants, you see that the body shape is pretty much indiscernible under those robes. There's no real sense of movement. The figures are stiff and they're fully frontal. And while they overlap, there's no real sense of depth. On the other hand, the Jacob frieze lacks perspective. So while the figures are modeled, the scene is still essentially flat. So it contains Byzantine elements as well. Here's the second image from the Vienna Genesis. Again, we see continuous narrative, Rebecca coming to the well and just below her meeting with Jacob's representative and servant and chosen representative Eleazar. We also see a number of classical elements, which I've circled. So what are they? Well, most obviously, I didn't actually circle this when I called it out. There's that sexy lady by the spring who appears to be a water nymph, or at least a personification of the well. Rather out of place in a Christian Bible, and evidence that pagan images would persist well into the Christian era. Personifying elements of nature was part of the classical tradition. You see a lot of statues, for instance, to river gods. Note, too, the colonnades along Rebecca's path and the shading and modeling on the camels, which gives them a sense of depth that contrasts with the flatness of later Byzantine art. So what makes that walled city, which I've circled in green, a more Byzantine or maybe medieval image? Well, for one thing, it's fortified. These are now much more dangerous times. Pax Romana is no more. But the building also lacks proper perspective. Really, it seems to be just floating in space. So let's play detective again. Why do you think the College Board included these works? Well, one answer is pretty straightforward. This is the oldest surviving, well-preserved, at least, illustrated Bible. I think the other reason is that the illustrations so clearly show evidence of the transition between classical and Byzantine style. Art history textbooks divide periods into neat chapters. Real life and art seldom divide up so tidily. These aren't required works, but I thought you might be interested in seeing some more images from the same text. While the narratives show movement, again, the figures seem rather stiff and stylized, although somewhat more naturalistic than in the mosaics. So you've been looking at Byzantine images for an entire class period. You've also learned more about iconoclasm, a subject that fascinates the College Board, so it will certainly show up on your unit test. If you have any time left, I'd like you to close by talking about what ties this icon to the classical world that was fading away and what in it reveals an essentially Byzantine worldview. Think especially about facial expressions, the position of the bodies in space. I love Byzantine art and regret that we're rushing through it so quickly, although we have lingered in Hagia Sophia. Those of you joining me at the Met this spring, it has a wonderful Byzantine gallery, and I have put it on my list. To close on a sadder note, Hagia Sophia ended its career as a Christian church in a bloodbath. Some reports say that blood ran as much as 6 inches thick through the cathedral. So here's one eyewitness account. When there was no longer any resistance, the enraged Turkish soldiers roamed through the town, stealing, disrobing, pillaging, killing, raping, taking captive men, women, children, old men, young men, monks, priests, people of all sorts and conditions. Temples were ransacked and pillaged. Sacred objects were scornfully flung aside. The holy icons and the holy vessels were desecrated. Ornaments were burned, broken in pieces, or simply thrown in the streets. When the conqueror, Mehmed II, saw all that had perished and become ruin, a great sadness took possession of him, and he repented the pillage and all the destruction. And then, of course, he turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque. Today it is neither a church nor a mosque, but a museum, a tribute to one of the greatest buildings ever created.